Hello, everybody. My name's Lucy Coleman. I am an NEU activist from Oxfordshire, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first of today's Arise Festival discussions on class war in Britain, 40 years since the miners' strike. The 84 to 85 miners' strike is a pivotal moment in the history of the struggle for socialism in Britain. But this series of events is not designed to be a history class. And that's for the simple reason that everywhere we look, we are still experiencing the political and economic realities that were unleashed as a result of the strike. Whether that's the 0 hours contracts that we see, low pay, and a gig economy dominated by big finance. Essentially, the defeat of the miners and then ultimately the defeat of the labour movement resulted in, essentially the defeat of the miners and ultimately the defeat of the labour movement resulted in the collective cultural scars in coalfield communities, which have opened the door to the rise of the far right. But it also created the bonds of solidarity between the miners and other persecuted workers, both in Britain and internationally, which have lasted the decades and led to other forms of social transformation. 40 years after the start of the strike, today's series of panels will be exploring its causes, its significance at the time, and how it has shaped economics and politics in Britain since. And crucially, what lessons we can draw from the strike for our organising today. So before we get started, there's some quick housekeeping. So please do let us know where you're tuning in from in the Q&A box. And then also post your comments for discussion. And importantly, please post your questions for our speakers. Like all significant events, the causes of the strike and its legacy are hotly contested. The ruling class, as we know, have their version of events, but we must ensure that our story is also heard. So to kick off the discussion, we begin by asking the big question, what really happened during the 84 to 85 strike? And to answer this question, we are joined by our first speaker, Jon Hendy, KC. You're very welcome, Jon.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm sorry I was only arrived at 1 minute past 1. I apologise if everybody was getting nervous about that. I had some technical difficulties. Well, first of all, I guess a lot of people want to know what on earth a KC is doing talking about the miners' strike 40 years ago. So I better just explain why I am in a position to offer some thoughts on that. The reason is that there was a huge amount of litigation during the miners' strike. Obviously, everybody knows about the 10,000 arrests and the criminal prosecutions and the bindings over in magistrates' courts, and I think other speakers will talk about that. But there was a great deal of civil litigation as well. There was an action brought against the National Union of Mine Workers by the National Coal Board, but the National Coal Board under Sir Ian McGregor and the government quickly realised that the effect of pursuing legal action by the Coal Board, which was then obviously totally controlled by the government, against the NUM would only generate more sympathy and support for the miners. So they abandoned that and adopted a different tactic. And the different tactic was to try and organise dissident mine workers in the various areas in which the NUM operated. NUM, of course, was a federal union in the sense that it had a national union, the NUM itself, and various area unions like the Yorkshire, the NUM Yorkshire area, the NUM Scottish area, the NUM Kent area, and so on. So the idea was to get dissident mine workers to bring cases against the NUM, which they thought might generate more sympathy for those opposed to the strike. And this strategy was actually dreamed up between Sir Ian McGregor, the chair of the National Coal Board, and one of the senior ministers, Lawson, in the Thatcher government. And if you read his book, McGregor's memoir afterwards, called The Enemies Within, he says this. He says, in parallel with our Department of Strategic Warfare, we would try to stimulate legal actions which would cost Scargill so much money that it would reduce his ability to finance flying pickets. It was the success of this area of operations which was to progressively tie the NUM up in knots, and ultimately may well have been the single most important factor in bringing about an end to the strike. Well, the strategy cannot be questioned, but his suggestion that it was that it tied the NUM up in knots and may have been the most important factor in bringing the end to a strike is absolute rubbish. What happened was there were a whole lot of legal actions arguing that the strike was in breach of the union rules. We lost every single one of those except an action in Scotland. And it's right that the orders were made that no money should be paid out in support of the strike, because it was alleged that it was in breach of either the area or the national rule book. And that led ultimately to fines on the union's sequestration of the assets, that's to say seizure of all the assets down to the last paper clip in the office, and the putting in of lawyers to administer the union. Well, we haven't got time to go into all that detail now, but I thought I'd just say, well, first of all, I should just say what my role in it was. I was junior counsel to the various firms of solicitors that represented the various areas, and to the National Union of Mine Workers, and therefore I was in a position to keep an eye on all the legal actions in all the areas. And I spent really 18 months, because the legal actions obviously lasted longer than the strike did, doing nothing but NUM work. But what's relevant today, perhaps, is just to deal with a couple of things. One is that one of the principal arguments used against the area unions and the national union was that the strike in each area was in breach of the rules of the union, because it was a national strike and not area strikes. Actually, that is completely wrong, because although the National Executive Committee approved strike action in every area, the strikes in each area were in compliance with their own rule books. I remember doing a case, for example, for the Durham Mine Workers Association, the Durham area of the NUM, in which an injunction was granted against the union on the basis that the strike in the Durham area was in breach of its own rules, and it simply wasn't. The union had carried out to a letter what was required of a strike of the Durham area. They'd had a meeting in every lodge in the area, and every lodge had carried a motion in favour of the strike. Those motions had been then approved by the executive committee of the area, then submitted to the national union, which had approved the strike. So it was just it was a law stood on its head, really. But it brings me to a couple of more general points. You'll give me an indication when you want me to shut up, won't you? But a couple of more general points. And one of them is this, arising from this question of a national strike or not. It's often said by critics of the union that, and using the same sort of personalisation as McGregor did in that passage we've just looked at, that Arthur Scargill refused to hold a national ballot. There's two propositions that are wrong with that. One is that the decision was not Arthur Scargill's. It was a meeting of a special conference of the National Union of Mine Workers that decided that there would not be a national ballot. And the reason for that was that those areas which had already taken strike action, in Yorkshire, Scotland, Durham, I can't remember, said, and very articulately, because we've got the verbatim minutes of what was said, they said, we are not submitting our strike to a national ballot. We have called a ballot in our area, and we are going to stick with that. And we are not going to submit this strike to a national ballot. So that's the reason why there wasn't a national ballot, because some areas were already on strike in accordance with their own rules, and all they needed was the approval of the NEC to do that. The second thing that I just wanted to raise, another criticism which is levelled against the mine workers and against Arthur Scargill personally, is that they chose the wrong time to hold a coal strike, because it was at the beginning of March, just at a time when energy usage in the country was about to diminish as the temperatures warmed up in the spring and the summer. Again, that's complete rubbish. The NUM, and Arthur Scargill in particular, had no control over when this strike would happen. Let me just take you back some decades. In 1972, the Tory party drew up a document which you can Google and download called Stepping Stones. And in 1974, another report for the Tories called the Ridley Report. Those two documents were the plan by which the Tory party was going to take on the unions in this country, beginning, they thought, with the National Union of Mine Workers, in order to defeat the unions. And it was all planned out in advance: a nationalised police force, opening up private docks so that the well-organised dockers of the time couldn't boycott coal, organising private lorry drivers to shift coal because they knew that the ASLEF and the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers wouldn't shift coal, and so on. All planned. And of course, they planned the date on which they were going to start the strike. And the way that they engineered the strike was, of course, to announce suddenly that there would be a series of pit closures, beginning with Polmaze in Scotland and Corton Wood in Yorkshire, and I can't remember the other two or three that were announced. And the effect of that, of course, was that take Yorkshire, for example, they immediately decided to take industrial action. They'd had a ballot back in 1981 that if ever a pit was to be closed without consent and without going through the relevant negotiating procedure, they would take strike action. But they, again, put the strike proposal through their regional machinery, and it was proposed. And that, of course, was at the very beginning of March 1984. So the unions and the miners had no say whatever over this strike. If they could, of course, have said, all right, well, let them close these pits, we'll fight later in the year. But the outcome of that is too bloody obvious to mention, isn't it? They'd have just gone on closing pits. And let me remind you that Arthur got a brown envelope, which must have originated in the National Coal Board very early in the strike, which disclosed the plan to close 70 collieries. And he announced that on television and was derided by the government and the Coal Board for doing so. Turns out that it was in fact 75 pits, and whoever the mole was in the National Coal Board had missed 5 off the list. So there was no doubt. And then, of course, we saw nearly a decade later in 1993, when Heseltine closed a further 30 pits, or was about to close 30 pits, that this was the plan, was to shut the entire coal industry. But I don't know how much longer I've got, but I would like to say one more generalisation about this Tory plan. This was not just bitterness because the Coal Board had lost the strike in 1972 and the one in 1974. You remember that was the one where Heath said, "Who runs the country? Vote for the Tories or vote for the mine workers." And the country decided that they were not going to vote Tory. They voted in Harold Wilson's government in 1974. Of course, that had an emotional impact on the Conservative planners and plotters. But the real impetus to this was their adoption of neoliberalism, the idea that trade unions, amongst other things, that trade unions had no role in regulating the terms and conditions of workers. No problem about trade unions organising cheap mortgages, cheap holidays, cheap insurance for their members. But if they were going to be involved in collectively bargaining terms and conditions, this was a distortion of the free labour market adopted by the neoliberals. And this plan to take on the unions was the first step in implementing neoliberalism. And we know what happened as a consequence. They closed the entire coal industry to demonstrate that insubordination of the kind. Insubordination, by the way, is a word used by Ian McGregor in the memoir I mentioned. To demonstrate that insubordination by union members and by unions simply would not be tolerated, and that unions were to be excluded from all aspects of national and social life. No longer tea and sandwiches at number 10, no longer involved in economic planning or any of that kind of thing, no longer to be consulted over the industrial strategy of the country, total exclusion. And then, of course, what followed in the 1980s was 6 acts of parliament which restricted trade unions from taking industrial action. And the consequences of that we see today. The absolute devastation, not just of mining communities, but working class communities up and down the country. The level of poverty we see today hasn't been seen since the 1930s, or possibly since Victorian times. The value of real wages hasn't risen for over 15 years. We've got over 1 million people on 0 hours contracts. People on 0 hours contracts don't even know how much money they're going to get at the end of the week. They can plan absolutely nothing. They can't put money aside for the kids' new shoes or any of that kind of thing. These are the consequences of neoliberalism, but more than that, they are the consequences of the fact that we lost the miners' strike. Now, Chair, I don't know whether you want me to ramble on. I can go on all day about this, but I'm very conscious there are other speakers who've got a lot more to contribute than I have. So perhaps that's enough for opening.
Thank you so much, Jon. Really helpful to have that context of the strike and the legal actions, and how the Tories had that concerted effort to defeat the Labour movement. And also great that you're able to put that context in how that's relevant to us today. Thank you so much for that, and you're staying on for some questions later on. And so just a reminder to everybody who's here, I'm told that we've got hundreds of people joining us for this discussion from Derbyshire, Leicester, London, Stockport, Bamber Bridge, Liverpool, Hove, Paisley, Dorset, Skipton, Northampton, but we've also got people here internationally from Botswana and New Zealand. So welcome to everybody, and please do pop your questions into the Q&A box, and Jon will be back at the end to answer those. So before we move on to our next speaker, we have got a short video to give us a little bit more context. So it's a video of Arthur Scargill, which follows on from what Jon was just talking about, the huge struggle, and gives us a bit more context for our discussion.
After 7 months, not fighting for the National Union of Mine Workers, not fighting for the jobs of miners, but fighting against the whole concept of this government's economic policy, which is designed to destroy jobs and to wreak havoc amongst the British labour and trade union movement. We've challenged the whole basic concept of this Conservative government's philosophy. I reject the right of any employer to turn round and destroy the jobs of miners or any other workers. We should not stand aside when faced with the fact that communities may be laid desolate as a result of the economic philosophy either of this government or an employer or both. As we go into the 8th month of this dispute, there's one thing coming through loud and clear. The miners' union are winning this fight, and they're not only winning it for miners, they're winning it for you in the entire labour and trade union movement. There can be no doubt about the logic of our case. If logic, eloquence and justice had been the hallmark of what should have been done, we would have won this case months ago. But we've got to overcome a government whose bloody-mindedness has made thousands and thousands of our people face a situation that they've not faced since 1926. We've got food kitchens established in every village. We've had 3,000 of our people injured on picket lines. We've had 5 of our people killed as they fight for the right to work. For God's sake, colleagues, give support to our resolution and to the statement of the NEC, and take us with you and with the NUM on the way to victory.
So that short clip leads us on to our next speaker, who is very welcome, Chris Peace from Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign.
Many thanks and greetings, comrades. Thank you so much to Arise for organising this. In fact, thank you for your support for years now in our campaign. And it's an honour to follow Jon and how he explained how the strike was run and controlled. Leading on from that, obviously we are 40 years further down the road since this happened, and it's been incredible this year seeing the sheer number of anniversary events, the sheer number of people wanting to find out more about what happened. And it's important to remember, as we do rightly recognise the heritage and the importance of the movement as it was before the strike, it's important that we remember the solidarity. But our campaign is a rather sad reminder that there are ongoing issues of accountability and basically a working class historic misjustice, which is still very much live and unsolvent at the moment. The day at Orgreave was one that was very different to the strike as it happened. It happened in June of 1984. So the strike had been going on from the March, and to be quite honest, going quite well. You've heard from Jon, and I know that we've sent a link to the Ridley report that you can read on our website. And clearly there was a very determined blueprint and clear plan that the Conservatives had put in place to pick this fight with the National Union of Mine Workers. The policing during the strike had increased in numbers and also in brutality. So whilst Orgreave was an extremely brutal and the most brutal day of the strike thus far, the days and weeks leading up to it nationally had seen a change in the way it was policed. And it's important to remember just as Jon mentioned about what was happening behind the scenes, that there was a secret committee that was set up to monitor the strike. This was secret from even the Parliament and MPs at the time, and they had put together a secret manual for policing. Now, this only had the eyes of the chief constables and of members of that secret committee, and it dramatically changed the police tactics, allowed them to operate basically as a quasi-military force. And that didn't go through Parliament. It was unknown about to MPs even, and therein was the allowance and the plan for how you police by fear, by terror, to try to persuade miners to give up the fight. 18th of June, miners were welcomed by the police in the early hours to Orgreave coking plant. Instead of being turned away at police blocks, they were showed where to come. In a way, it was almost like they were led there, not as a trap necessarily, but certainly not knowing what was going to be happening. Certainly the miners who were there speak about it being quite a different day. And when they saw the sheer numbers of police there with horses, with dogs, long lines of police with lawn shields, they realised that there was something afoot. After the lorries, who, as Jon mentioned, scab lorry drivers were brought in to try to transport coke into the coking plant. Then there was what you called on the picket line a ritual push. It was something that happened on every single picket line. The miners pushed forward, the police put back, and it just went to and fro like that. What happened next was very different, because the lines were broken and horses came out. Not as a trot, as was tried to be asserted during the trial, but as a good, strong canter into a crowd of thousands of people. And it's hard to imagine being there, but many miners have said if you weren't scared for your life, you weren't there, basically. I just want to read a few extracts, because what followed several charges of horses was a snatch squad of miners with short shields and truncheons who ran into the crowd, who were trying to run away, and followed them. And this happened for several hours, not just in one location, but around there. Just want to read a short commentary. We've got hundreds of these from miners who were there. One miner says, when the police assaulted me, I was 1.5 miles from the coking plant on the top side, way over the bridge, almost at Handsworth. We'd had the ritual push when the lorries came. It wasn't violent, just become a ritual, a token push. After that first push, where I think they were waiting for, all hell broke loose. The short shield units came in along the long shields. They just parted. Horses came in. I tried to get out. You could either go down an embankment that took you onto the live railway lines, or over a very narrow bridge. We went over the bridge. I saw a guy get injured, so I stopped and got down on one knee to help him. 2 police officers came over, and bump, the back of my head was done in, and I was gone. I was covered in blood. Police could have been in no doubt that I was seriously injured. They pulled me up, one on each arm, and started walking me away. As they did that, I was punched by another copper and called a bastard. He went on, and he then had a fractured skull. So the injuries were serious, and they were life-changing. At the time, there was calls for something to be done about this. That what was shown on the news in the evening was clearly it was doctored by the BBC. It was shown in reverse. I think this is a well-known story. It's true, unfortunately. The BBC still have the rushes of the footage of the day showing how it was the police who acted violently first. But people called for something to be done about what had happened that day. What happened instead is 95 miners were charged with riot and unlawful assembly. The trial didn't happen until a year later, in July 1985. And after 48 days of prosecution evidence, police officer evidence, the prosecution made a decision that they had no case. Their evidence was shown to be unreliable, shown to be fabricated, shown to be lies that were told in order to get convictions. The miners, the prosecution threw in the case. The judge ruled no case to answer, and the cases and charges against all 95 miners were formally dismissed, and nothing further happened. No accountability. No explaining about why such a high-profile trial should end in such a way. So our campaign was formed in 2012. We had to fight for years with the Tory government asking for some kind of inquiry. Why this happened in the first place, to show the proof that we have already got, that it was ordered from the top of government to behave in this way for the political ideology and reasons that Jon has already outlined. We want the truth to be told about the role the media played in spreading the false narratives, and we want the accountability given for the fact that a government chose to use the police in this way as an arm of the state against its own people. This is something that you hear about happening in other places in the world, and you cannot believe it, but it happened here in 1984. I want to just bring your attention to this report. This came out earlier this year. There'll be a link to it in the chat. In here, we lay out what happened and what the case for an inquiry is. We know that we've now got a Labour government, and I'm very pleased to confirm that the Home Secretary met with us a couple of weeks ago and confirmed that there will definitely be something happening. We need some kind of an inquiry, somebody that has got the power to compel all relevant files to be released. We know there are still police documents embargoed until 2066. There are also other documents embargoed until 2071. We need to have this body to bring together all the evidence that is already out there, evidence that has got clear links from the top of government down to operational police matters. That all needs to be properly considered and gone through. We need to have personal witness statements brought to that inquiry from those in police and government and other public servants at the time, and most importantly, the miners and their families. All of this needs to be pulled together in a matrix to show what happened. It has to be done because the long-term effects of the strike are still there for people on a wider sense, as we've heard, but also on a personal sense. And I want to just read another extract from another miner saying, "I've still got the scar from the busted head I had. I had a truncheon wield, a fractured skull. I had to go back to the hospital as I started to get headaches and double vision. Had to have a drainage done. That was before the trial. I have terrible paranoia that they're waiting to get us for something else because we challenged them and made them look stupid. I have these thoughts that when I go to put the news on, it will start all over again." And a miner's wife says, "We've tried to get back to normal, but it's never gone away. I don't think it ever will. I've got a daughter grown up now, and a few years back she called me saying I needed to come home. She'd phoned the doctor because of the state she'd found her dad in. The doctor came to her house and said he was suffering from trauma." That goes on. So these are very real injuries, and they are catastrophic outcomes for the country that we live in today. So please follow our campaign. You can do things. You can obviously read our report, tell people what you've seen. Please help us keep this campaign going by buying our merchandise, which you can do on our website. On our website, you will also find a draft letter that you can send to the Home Secretary. We've had a promise that something will happen, which is amazing. However, we need this to happen in this government. It must happen in the next few years because we have already lost so many people who have died without seeing justice done. There can be no further delay for what happened that day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. And it's just so powerful to hear the words of miners and their family who were there, and the impact that this day had on them. It's so important that we do hear the truth and share the truth, and that we fight for justice and the full inquiry, and that everybody takes those actions that you've just mentioned at the end there. So thank you so much, Chris. Before we move to questions, we have another short video clip that comes from the archives of Arthur Scargill. So we're going to watch that.
I say to the people of Britain, if you stand aside while miners are beaten to the ground by a paramilitary police force in riot gear, what they do to us today, they'll do to you tomorrow.
Great. And yeah, as Arthur Scargill says, we're still seeing the impact of that. Again, just before we move to the questions, I'm just going to bring in Ben Foley, just very briefly.
Thanks for that, Lucy. Yeah, I'm Ben Foley. I'm a supporter and a volunteer for Arise. I'm here to make a plug for any donations you can give to support our work. And in doing that, I just want to, because we're in the final month of the year, or almost in the final month of the year, I want to give you a quick reminder of all the work and all the events that Arise has been involved in, working as it does to be a broad and inclusive left project to bring together lots of partner organisations. And it's worth remembering how Arise has organised discussions on a whole range of events, from urgent issues in the news today to more theoretical discussions. We've been partnering with Labour Outlook, which provides daily updates and commentary as a blog site. We've been organising discussions on the budget and wider economic events and struggles with the Labour Assembly against austerity, including speakers like John McDonnell, Grace Blakely, Richard Bergen. We've been discussing events in the Labour Party and at the TUC and in the union movement. We've had discussions on Palestine with Labour and Palestine Solidarity Campaign, a series of socialist discussions on Latin America and on Ireland. And on the 100th anniversary of his death, we've been involved in a series of theoretical discussions, in fact, organising them on the thinking of Lenin, what it meant whilst he was active politically, what it's meant since, and how we might apply that thinking today. And there are still lots more events this year. We've got 4 more, at least, I think, before we reach the end of the year. And they include next Thursday, the 28th, we've got the annual Engels Lecture, which is with the economist Michael Roberts. So that's next Thursday, the 28th. And then we've got the following day an event on the importance of public ownership and control, as the debate on public ownership of bits of the economy is coming to life in the current moment, and we're doing that with We Own It. So as I say, there's lots going on, lots more to do. And if you enjoy these events, please do make a donation. We are making an ask for those of you who can do that for £20, but if you can make any kind of donation, that's appreciated. There is a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, which is largely done in volunteers' free time. It's planning events, it's contacting speakers, advertising and promoting, financing the technical side of distributing and advertising and streaming. We're doing this on Zoom, but it goes across YouTube, X, Facebook. No doubt we'll have to do it on Blue Sky and other platforms in future, and it goes as a podcast on Spotify. So as I say, there's a lot going on. There's a lot that does actually cost money as well. So if you can, please make a donation. If you can, make that £20, but anything you can do, thanks for your support. And I'll let's go back to the questions of the speakers now, but thanks for your support.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you for highlighting the important work that Arise does for the movement. So we've got a couple of quite specific questions that have come in. So I'm going to read out there's 4 quite specific questions, and then I'll come back for one general question at the end. So the first question has come from a viewer who's on Facebook, who has asked, said, John spoke about the way the state would use the courts to attack the miners. Can the panel see any parallels in the way that this was done then and how the law has been used in recent times to attack workers or people campaigning for a better world, such as climate justice activists, and assess where our right to resist stands today? So that was the first quite specific question. And then another topical question has come in specifically for Jon, which says part of the outcome of the strike was to launch a wave of anti-trade union laws. And today the government have tabled the Employment Rights Bill. What are the panelists' views on the bill, and how far does it go in ditching those laws that were the legacy of the strike? Two more. A specific one from Andy on Zoom, who asks if UK law on secondary picketing is the most onerous in Western countries. Isn't it? Is the question. And then Dave Pedder on Zoom has asked to Chris, did the BBC ever apologise for its alteration of the chronology it did to the video from Orgreave? So those are the four quite specific questions, and then there's one more general. So shall I bring Jon first?
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't make a note of the first one. Just remind me of the topic. I don't read it all, but
okay, yeah, no, that's fine. So it was more about parallels between
use of the law,
miners.
Yeah, okay. Yes, well, look, there was nothing unique about the use of the civil law and indeed the criminal law against the miners. The law has been used really since the beginning of trade unionism. In fact, you might go further than that, say from the beginning of industrial action. And industrial action has got a very long history indeed. First strike is recorded in the pyramids in ancient Egypt 5,000 years ago. I don't know that there was any legislation or litigation that followed that, but certainly by the time of the 14th century, law was being used to prevent organizations of workers following the Black Death when there was a shortage of labor. And in at the end of the 18th century, 1799 and 1800, Parliament passed what they call the Combination Acts, which were to prevent workers banding together in trade unions, and of course prevent them taking collective action by way of industrial action. And that was really only mitigated towards the end of the 19th century. We've only had the ability to take strike action, not even the right to take strike action, since 1906. We can't go through the whole history of it, but the 6 acts that I mentioned in the 1980s severely restricted trade unions' abilities to take industrial action. And to answer the third question, absolutely banned secondary picketing. You're only allowed to picket the place at which you work, or if you've been sacked, at the place at which you had worked. And therefore, those who remember the Wapping dispute with the print workers, remember that Murdoch moved the premises from Fleet Street to Wapping. The consequence was that the pickets had nowhere lawfully to picket because their place of work had gone. So to answer that question, yes, we have the most restrictive ban on picketing action anywhere in Europe. So yes, the problems of legislation and litigation don't go away. The Tories, of course, in recent years have tried to increase that. Trade Union Act 2016, Strikes Minimum Service Level Act 2023. The current government have mitigated that to the extent that they've removed they are proposing, rather, the Employment Rights Bill proposes to repeal the Strikes Minimum Service Level Bill Act and to get rid of most of the Trade Union Act 2016, but it doesn't repeal those major acts back in the 1980s. It tinkers with some of it, makes strike notices a little bit easier, and so on, but it doesn't remove those restrictions, which I think is one of the most serious weaknesses with the Employment Rights Bill. I've probably taken my share of the answers, haven't I?
Thanks, John. Chris, your
Yeah,
thoughts?
I'll just come in. Yeah, John's pretty much covered what the actual law is, but can I just remind you, and it's in our report in section 3 of it, called Public Statements versus Private Acts. So what we have now in terms of legislation that can quite frankly get you criminalised for fighting for your job is there out in the open, and we're wringing our hands about how bad it is, and it's terrible. But also don't ever forget what lengths the state will go to in private, behind the scenes. And I think this is why our inquiry is so important, because in here we've broken everything down. I know you can't read the writing, but we've given you, for every incident, we've given you a column telling you what was being said publicly, but also from the research that has been done, what was actually happening behind the scenes. And it's important to recognise behind the scenes from the workers involved, the miners, behind the scenes from us, the public, but also behind the scenes of Parliament, who makes laws that things should go through. I'm really pleased you asked about the BBC as well. The short answer is they kind of said sorry, not sorry. But if I could just give you a quick quote from this is from the 19th of June 1984. The Assistant Director General, who was a fellow called Alan Prothero, had said in a meeting held by senior staff, this is the day after Orgreave, that he had the feeling that the BBC's early evening coverage of Orgreave, quote, might not have been wholly impartial, unquote. And he felt that despite his often repeated warnings, this was against what he called adjectival reporting. There was a further meeting the following year where the same man said that he felt haunted by it. In 1991, eventually, there was an acceptance by the BBC that they had got the footage in the wrong order. And they said that this had happened as a result of a very inexperienced editor, which is absolute bull, basically. The footage was perfectly edited to tell the story that they wanted to get out there. So I mentioned that the rushes, the unedited film footage taken that day, is still with the BBC, and they've sat on it for 40 years.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, interesting BBC response, and very useful responses to the other questions. So there's just one final question, which is a bit more out there. So Linda Rose on Zoom has asked what other endings of the strike could have been possible, and was there any point during the strike where they might have won, and how would things have been different if they had? So to whoever wants to come in first on that one.
Well, shall I go first, Chris? Yeah, there were several points during the strike. I think there were 3 where negotiations had reached tentative agreement. I know one of them was subsequent agreement between the National Union and the National Coal Board. One of them I know was vetoed by Margaret Thatcher personally. I can't quite remember how the other 2 collapsed, but they did collapse. But right at the end of the strike, at the beginning of March 1985, I think the general view was that, of course, the miners were on their knees, absolutely on their knees. I mean, people had been ripping up floorboards to burned to keep warm and so on. Mortgages had been seized. People were homeless. I mean, it was just dreadful. But the union was very, very close to winning that strike. I remember being taken to picket lines in the southeast of the country, to power stations where they were saying, we're not bothering to picket this power station anymore. Just look at the yard. And you looked at the yard, you know, which was absolutely massive, where normally there was a mountain of coal and there was nothing, absolutely nothing. It was bare. So you know, one can understand why the strike came to an end when it did, but had it lasted a little bit longer, I think there's every chance that the government would have been forced to capitulate, because there would have been power cuts. If the miners had won, I think it would have made it a lot more difficult for the Tories to inflict the doctrine of neoliberalism through those 6 acts of Parliament and the many other things that they did as well, smashing up collective bargaining, deindustrializing the country, exporting whole industries to the third world and so on, and reducing this country really to misery. I mean, that's where we are today. I notice, for example, in the economic analysis produced by the present government to justify the Employment Rights Bill, it's pointed out that the average family today in Britain is 20% less wealthy than the average German family. I mean, that's an extraordinary achievement for a succession of governments since 1979 to bring the country to its knees. That's the real consequence of the loss of the miners' strike.
Yeah, to add to that, I think part of the reason that such brutal tactics were used by the police was to scare people. But it was also practically used to try to get people on bail as well, to try to keep them away, so they would have bail conditions not to go picketing. So, that was an effort that was done throughout. On specifically points at which it could be won, I think the NACODs, the deputies' position, there was a vote initially from the NACODs some way into the strike. They are the deputies who basically worked at the pit, who were basically keeping the pit alive and going whilst it was non-operational. And they indicated they would support strike action, and then that was very quickly overturned. But I think also we have to remember leadership here as well. On the ground, there was thousands and thousands and thousands of people supporting the miners' strike through the Labour Party and other political parties, through their trade union branches. There was a massive groundswell of support, activity, fundraising going on. But the leadership of the Labour Party at the time, and indeed some other unions, didn't stand together, and there was that break. There wasn't the support from the TUC that was needed as the strike went on. And I think we learn these lessons. Sadly, we see them repeated as well, where we don't have leadership shown politically for mass action. 165,000 miners on strike for a year. You can't even imagine it now. But that huge swell of action and support that was happening by activists was not matched by leadership.
Thank you both. And I think it highlights the sad consequences of losing the miners' strike, but also that question has brought us to think about the lessons that we can learn, and I think your point about leadership is really important, that we're constantly building leadership at all levels of the movement, and that we really do seize opportunities where we see them and don't let those opportunities drift away. Did either of you have any sort of final comments you wanted to make before we finish up? Jon?
Yeah, can I just make two very quick points? I see the force of everything that Chris has said, but we ought to pay respect to the leadership of the National Union of Mine Workers itself and the leadership in most of the areas, and of course to the women's support groups who were so heroic and exercised such magnificent leadership throughout that strike. The other point, I was also provoked by something that Chris said, which was the battle going on behind the scenes. We haven't mentioned, and no doubt somebody will later on, the degree of surveillance by the state. Everybody, all the legal teams had their phones tapped. I know my phone was tapped at home, and we know that there was a mole in the NUM headquarters and so on. The surveillance was just absolutely overwhelming. And of course, now we're 40 years later, the technology is so sophisticated, and artificial intelligence added to that technology means that everything that trade unionists or anybody in opposition to the state and the establishment is going to be monitored. You can be absolutely sure of that. So I think it's something that people ought to bear in mind for the future.
Yes, and I would say that, you know, we're almost there with our campaign. We need some kind of an inquiry to go ahead. And I just mentioned briefly Hillsborough. Hillsborough happened just a number of miles away from Orgreave 5 years later. There was something that happened. Hillsborough exhausted its legal process. It had the public inquiries, which didn't help. The first inquest ruled most of the evidence inadmissible. And what happened was there had to be some kind of bringing together of the evidence. And what the government allowed, it was a Labour government at the time, was what they called the Hillsborough Independent Panel. Now, this was given the powers, all those things I mentioned earlier, to be able to get evidence brought before it, be able to consider everything together. And the government set that up with people on there with the right experience and skills to be on there, and it agreed to be bound by the findings. The process of the Hillsborough Independent Panel was what got David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the day, up on his feet in Parliament, and for the first time apologising for the lies that had been told about Hillsborough and saying that there would be a second inquest. Now, we feel very strongly that something like the Hillsborough Independent Panel, that format, would deliver for what we need to do. When people talk about public inquiries, they think this is something that goes on for years and years. It's very adversarial. It's all about lawyers. Not the case for what we need. So something like that would work. If you read our report, which I'll mention again, but the main thing for us is that we may have got the promise, but it has to happen in this Parliament. It has to happen. If we end up with a Tory government coming back in, they will not allow it. And we need it because people are literally dying. So please help us keep that pressure on now that we're so close to hopefully getting truth and justice. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much to both our speakers, Chris and Jon. And that nicely brings this first session to a close. So I am going to pass over to Andy, who is chairing the next session. Thank you for listening in, and thanks to Arise for organising this session.
Thanks, Lucy. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Andy Kuchongi, and I'm from the General Federation of Trade Unions Executive Committee, and I'm also an activist in NAPO, the Union for Probation and Family Court Staff. Welcome to the second of this afternoon's Arise Festival discussions on class war in Britain, 40 years since the miners' strike. Firstly, just some housekeeping. Please let us know where you're tuning in from in the Q&A box if you haven't done so yet. Also post your comments for discussion, most importantly your questions for the speakers in the Q&A box. Please also donate at the link posted in the chat so we can keep holding important political education events like this. As Ben said earlier, they're organising a whole variety of events in collaboration with others and doing such an important work for the movement, so any contributions, no matter how small or big, are greatly appreciated. In the last session, we heard what really happened during the strike. Our title for this section of the discussion is The Role of the State, Media and Ruling Class in the Class War in Britain, Lessons for Today. The 84-85 strike marked a dramatic break from the post-war establishment and expansion of the welfare state. In the shadow of the three-day week, a decade before, and the winter of discontent, the Thatcher government attempted to resolve the economic crisis by imposing a new neoliberal consensus. This new framework that we live with today saw the balance of wealth and power in the economy shift decisively in favour of capital. As the event at Orgreave horrifyingly demonstrated in the last session, this was done with the full force of the state and state-sanctioned brutal violence. But while the miners faced physical attacks on pickets, they were also attacked in the media. There was even a US-based academic movement, the so-called Chicago Boys, that gave the appearance of intellectual rigour to Thatcher's plans for the economy. Their ideas were infamously tested 10 years earlier in Chile, following the savage coup against Salvador Allende. So the right-wing offensive on the miners was extensive, from state, the media, and academic institutions. At the time when we face our own economic crisis, attacked on the protest, the growth of far media influences, some of which masquerading as academics, the parallels with today are striking. To discuss what we can learn from them, we're joined, first of all, by Jon Trickett MP. I believe that's a pre-recorded video that we're going to play first.
I guess most people watching this broadcast are well aware of the facts of the miners' strike. I'm not going to go through them. But what's less perhaps clear for those people who weren't around at the time is the kind of conditions that we lived on. And in Yorkshire, it was very, very difficult. You couldn't really move two men in a car. Me and my dad going to watch a rugby match or something would inevitably be stopped, maybe more than once as well, on a short journey. It was a kind of police state operation. You felt as if you were being hounded by the police and almost criminalised just for moving from one area to another. The police said they assumed that you were probably picketing and using the back roads to get to some settlement. Of course, picketing wasn't illegal, and it still isn't. But the police used extraordinary powers, organised by Downing Street, and using the full resources of the British state. And when people say the British state is somehow neutral, that it's a liberal organisation in a liberal democracy, don't fool yourselves. The police, even the armed forces, MI5, GCHQ, even the welfare system was used against the miners. For example, children starving, families starving because no money was being paid to the striking miners and the families didn't have enough to live on. You could go through the big cities and even through the villages and towns. On every corner there would be people collecting money with buckets to give to the miners to try to provide them with food. I'm a plumber by trade. I spent half my year of the strike going round fixing people's heating, especially in winter when the miners couldn't afford to repair what happened to the house. Yorkshire was under a form of colonial government, and the power that was used was incredible. The police would hide who they were. You couldn't see whether they were Yorkshire policemen or people from London or wherever. And without the numbers, you couldn't identify. The criminal justice system was distorted in a disgraceful way. I know many in my patch who were arrested on false charges, trumped up charges with false statements by police officers sent to a magistrate's court, and the magistrates would say, well, we can't deal with your case now, so I'll hold you on bail, but the condition of bail is you don't attend any more pickets. And then the day after the strike, the charges were dropped. Time after time after time that happened. The magistrates must have known what was going on. The police certainly did. They were told what to write, and quite often you would receive statements from police given to an arrested minor. It would have exactly the same words written down as though it was a witness statement by a police officer, but actually it had been dictated from on high. The whole power of the state was used, and of course in Orgreave, 8,000 police officers were brought there with horses being used as cavalry to attack effectively unarmed miners. They were extraordinary times to live on. But what was it really all about? And what I think it was about was that the old system of ruling Britain, a sort of liberal form of capitalism, had come to an end. There was an economic and fiscal crisis, just as there always is. And the ruling class knew that it had to break the power of the working class in order to shift into a new gear. And that's what the miners' strike was about, breaking the power of the most advanced section of the British working class. And the fight was titanic, but at the end of it, we saw that Britain entered into a new era, an era of huge wealth for the rich, of massive dominating corporations striding across the globe like they were the new masters of the universe, and extreme poverty and deprivation, which we see to this day. 40 years of neoliberalism introduced by the miners' strike and the defeat which happened. I think we should regret that the fact that the labour movement didn't hold together, and it was quite difficult, let's be honest, to get the whole of the labour movement unified, but more could and should have been done. But here's my point. Neoliberalism, that epoch which Mrs. Thatcher brought it in, effectively is exhausted. It's now entering into a really quite a dangerous phase where it's relying on extreme right-wing political parties. We see that here and across Europe and in the United States and elsewhere. In order to deliver justice for the miners, which they still haven't received, we are going to have to tackle the whole neoliberal structures itself. And I think that's our next task. So I represent mining communities. My central argument about justice for the miners, pension fund properly paid, an amnesty for those people who were arrested falsely. Remember, many people who were falsely arrested were then sacked. And when the charges were dropped, they weren't reinstated, by the way. And a proper inquiry into the policing of the miners' strike, all of that, and then major investment in the mining communities and in all communities which have lost industry, the post-industrial communities like the ones I represent, would require a massive shift in direction, and nothing less is required. And if we want justice for the miners, it means a new social and economic order, and that's what I think we should be fighting for.
Thank you to Jon for that video. Our next speaker is Hugh Lanning, campaign organiser against ban on unions in GCHQ. Hugh, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, just unmuting. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the opportunity to speak. The trouble with history and the labour movement is that we tend to either be bound by it or we ignore it. So I'm not going to try and do some lessons from GCHQ, but some maybe observations based on my own experience. But first, for those of you who don't know what GCHQ is, a few things of history. Government Communications Headquarters. In 1984, 40 years ago, it was clandestine, not known about. It wasn't famous through spooks and other TV dramas, but it was a place where over 7,000 civil servant workers were organised in trade unions. There'd been a history of trade unions. And on the 25th of January, Margaret Thatcher's government announced a ban on trade unions in GCHQ, saying that there was, in their view, a fundamental conflict of loyalty between being a trade union member and working for the government in GCHQ. And that announcement triggered a 13-year campaign, which ended in 1997, where there was a sort of rare trade union victory, where Robin Cook kept Labour's promise to restore trade union rights to workers in GCHQ. Shortly after the ban was announced in 1984, I was in Dover, and I was invited to speak at a miners' meeting in the town hall in Dover, and it was packed to the rafters with miners from the militant Kent mines, which no longer exist. And Arthur Scargill had just received a standing ovation from them. But they still found time to listen politely to this story about civil servants in a place that they had never heard of then. But it wasn't happenstance that the two events took place at the same time. Thatcher was not only seeking revenge on the miners for the defeat in 1972, but she was also trying to be the forerunner of the neoliberalism. Its ideological determination has been referred to already, to destroy and dismember the trade union movement in this country, and in particular its ability to disrupt the freedom of the market to exploit and profit from the many for the few. And in their eyes, the public sector was also part of the target, and GCHQ, they thought, was a weakest link that was the starting point on their attempt to roll back trade unions across the public sector, as well as taking on the organised traditional trade unions. So in January of this year, PCS and the TUC organised a march and rally in Cheltenham to celebrate the campaign, but also to challenge the anti-strike laws being put through Parliament, the minimum services legislation. And doing the research for that, for a fine booklet, which you can obtain on the PCS website about GCHQ and the return, I was just struck all the time about how different things were then in 1984 to the, if you like, the climate, the legal climate that John's been referring to today. The day after the ban, we organised walkouts across the civil service. We gave no notice to employers. We just phoned up the offices and asked workers to walk, and they did in their tens of thousands. In the February 1984, the TUC called a day of action, which they haven't been famous for doing, to oppose the ban. And workers in the railways, local government, and many other sectors took solidarity action, again, which would be illegal now. In 1988, when the workers were sacked for being union members, strikes took place across the country, no thresholds, none of the restrictions on balloting and strikes that exist today. It was a different industrial world. So it's important not to forget how successful the Tories have been in removing workers' rights, how much we have actually lost. It is why the actions of this Labour government are so important to restore rights, fairness and justice to the workplace. And we're talking not just about rights to the individuals, but crucially to trade unions as collective organisations. And that, I think, is one of the key fights we're going to face over the coming months, is to make sure that the legislation is as good as it can be to restore the rights that have been lost over the decades. So how did GCHQ campaign survive and eventually succeed? And hopefully these will be points that are helpful to others. There's been some talk of leadership, but my first strength, I think, from the campaign was the members. We often focus on the leadership, but it was the determination of the sacked members and their families not to give up. I remember in the aftermath of 1992, when Labour lost, a bit like Trump winning now, the members said, 5 more years, okay, we're up for it. We're going to carry on running the campaign for as long as it takes to get our rights back. They were, maybe it would say ordinary members, but they were extraordinary members, and they should be given the leading role in campaigns. The second was unity. There were 7 unions recognised in GCHQ, together with the TUC and the International Trade Union Movement. They stuck together. Although there were difficult times, they managed to keep together throughout all of the 13 years, and that unity played a vital role in the campaign. There was also a commitment. 13 years is a long time to keep on marching, campaigning, and the unions matched the determination of the members by keeping it financed, keeping the political commitment going through all of that time when it had been possible to walk away. We also identified the opposition at the time, the Labour Party, it having been a government action to ban unions, that they were the key focus. And we managed to get commitments from them to restore trade unions, 41 commitments to do it. But even with that, we still had to hold their feet to the fire at the end when Robin Cook took up the challenge and actually restored trade unions. And we were lucky. I think the last point I would say, we were lucky that the nature of the issue, it wasn't an industrial dispute in the same way as the miners and other disputes at the time. It was about the fundamental right to belong to the union, which enabled us to have a broader, wider alliance and campaign than maybe would have been possible on some other issues. It was about the right to join and for unions to organise. But I suppose the one lesson that I would draw from it is that whatever we achieve in the future, it's got to be more than a legal right. It's got to be the right to join and organise without fear. If that fear remains, then it's only going to be a token justice. And workplace justice requires free trade unions, the freedom to organise and to operate. Keir Starmer talks about a partnership with workers, but a partnership is not a true one if one party has their hands tied behind their back. So the coming months are crucial to ensuring that the pain and success and struggles of the last 40 years are not wasted. We don't just need to remember the past, we need to rebuild the future. And if you're interested in finding out more about GCHQ, the booklet, the video, and the book are all available through the PCS website for you to find out more. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about GCHQ.
Thank you for your contribution, Hugh. I think it's always inspiring to hear about the victory of the workers through unity and solidarity at GCHQ. We're moving now on to a short video clip. One of the themes of this session is the media war on the miners, and I'm pleased to now introduce a short video clip from Dennis Skinner at the time.
Do you really think that the BBC are going to put over a decent case for the miners when Mrs Thatcher is poking her nose in every 5 minutes? Of course not. And do you think they're going to do that when lots of people in the BBC are thinking, well, if I keep my mouth shut and do the decent thing by the government and Mr McGregor, I might get a knighthood like Sir Robin Day got? And the same is true. Those in IBA might think, well, if I grovel long enough, I'll get a knighthood like Sir Alistair Burnett got from Mrs Thatcher. You can see it now with Brian Walden on Weekend World every Sunday. No man has grovelled more at the knees of Mrs Thatcher in so short a time in order to get his knighthood. Now, you have to understand that these mere baubles count with these people.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Niamh Iliff, Nottingham student and anti-austerity campaigner. Niamh, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Thank you, Arise, for hosting today's event. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the impacts of the miners' strike today for students and for young workers. And I just want to start by making it very clear that the miners' strike was not just about coal. It was about the power of the unions, the power to organise, to demand better, and to resist the neoliberal agenda of Thatcher's government. With over 140,000 miners in their communities standing up to a government determined to dismantle not just their industry, but the very concept of organised labour, this was state repression on an industrial scale, thrust into the mainstream for all of us to see, and a lesson in how far the ruling class will go to protect their own power. And today, nearly 4 million workers in the UK face precarious employment. The tactics of class war have clearly evolved, but they remain as brutal as ever. And the lessons from the miners' strike remain as important to us today as ever before. So myself, being a worker in the gig economy today, is one of the most difficult industries to be in. I've only worked 0-hour contract jobs without holiday, sick leave, pensions, not knowing when your hours are going to come from. And there's over 10% of the British population in this sector. The majority of the people in this group are women, people of colour, first-generation immigrants. The fight after the miners' strike in insecure work is so much more than just our industry. It's about shaping our societies as a whole. With workers being outsourced as contractors in zero-hour contract roles, the workplace is more individualised and fragmented than ever before. This lack of community at work leads to young people being more disillusioned and left behind by mainstream politics. This is exactly the contemporary version of insecurity and working class division that Thatcherism sought to enforce in the miners' strike. The communities torn apart by Thatcher were the only way to break the unions. And so today, we must learn from the miners' strike to build solidarity, to build communities, and to build our strength to challenge the status quo. When the workers threatened state power, the state responded not with negotiation, but with violence. With infamous police brutality of over 20,000 officers during the strikes, was no failure of the system, but the system doing exactly what it was designed to do: crush resistance and protect the interest of capital. The same tactics of policing continue and are normalised today, adapted to new forms of resistance, but rooted in the same logic of class war. And as a student organiser, I've seen how peaceful protests are met with heavy-handed police responses, with young precarious workers attempting to strike or demonstrate, facing surveillance, intimidation, and the threat of arrest. This mirrors the tactics used against the miners, proving the state's function in class war remains unchanged, but suppression is normalised. And the violence didn't end on the picket lines, as we saw in the video just beforehand. While the officers used batons to crush resistance, the press used headlines to fracture solidarity, turning public opinion against the miners. And in 1984, BBC footage of the miners attacking police at the Battle of Orgreave didn't show edited footage of the police charging first, of the miners defending themselves. This was not police, but it was an army attacking workers in battle. And this BBC framing was no accident, as Dennis Skinner explained, but a calculated move to shape public opinion on strikers, portraying workers as violent aggressors and the state as protectors of law and order. And the newspapers and political discourses obviously jumped on this, dubbing workers as the enemy within. And this was not just bad journalism, but class warfare fought through the airwaves and printing presses. Today, those same tactics are deployed, but updated for a digital age, discrediting striking workers and normalising the interests of the ruling class. We see it with healthcare workers today, deemed as selfish for striking for higher pay. It is not selfish to demand more from your employer, to stand with your colleagues and fight for dignity and respect at work. The media campaign of class interests has been so normalised since the miners, with social media algorithms prioritising anti-union rhetoric and burying worker-led content. There's a new battleground for propaganda. And in light of all of this, it's no surprise that exploited young workers today feel disconnected from traditional unions and their histories. So we must build community-based solidarity, as the miners did, to protect workers and provide the community missing for so many of us since the dawn of neoliberalism. The strategy of class war was not just about the miners. It was about sending a message to all workers. Resist, and you'll face the full force of the state. While they aimed to destroy solidarity, they couldn't distinguish the spirit of hope in the working class and a hope that is still alive in all of us today. And as a young trade unionist, I see echoes of their struggle every day, whether that's gig workers fighting for fair pay, students and staff demanding decent conditions, or public service workers standing together for what is right. The tactics of the ruling class have evolved, but so have our tools of resistance. And the miners taught us that victories are won so much more than just on picket lines, but in our communities, in our strength to fight for what is right, and in the solidarity we build across generations. So the lesson in my mind is very clear. We must build a labour movement capable of matching the collective power of the state, the media, and capital ownership, which means organising precarious workers, writing our own narrative, led by workers, and fighting for government policies that stand unapologetically with the working class today. The miners may have lost the strike, but they didn't lose the fight. And that fight is ours to continue, and we stand on their shoulders as we push forwards for a better future together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niamh. So important to hear from young activists like yourself continuing on that fight. Thanks for your contributions. Hugh and Niamh, there will be questions at the end, so bear with us. Our next speaker is Sean Errington from Friends of Arise. Sean, welcome to this afternoon's sessions. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you to all the speakers that have taken part today. My job is really simple in this little session. I'm here to ask you to formally become a friend of Arise. So what does that mean? Obviously, you are all comrades, but formally becoming a friend of Arise means committing to contributing £5 a month or more if you can afford it. You know, as others have mentioned today, both chairing and Ben in the last session, we've been organising a huge variety of events and collaborating with others and giving a platform to socialist ideas and activists. Over the past few years, we've been supporting international solidarity events, such as on Palestine, Latin America. We have had events such as today where we learn from history and socialist and labour movement activists and struggles that went before us. And we've also had events analysing current events and giving platforms to those resisting reactionary and regressive policies, such as the event that we had with the student activists who are resisting the tuition fee rise and arguing for free education the other week. All of these things are possible because volunteers give very, very generously of their time, but the companies that we use to put on these events don't give generously, so we have to pay them quite a lot of money. So Zoom, our email provider, that we send all the information out to you, the streaming platforms that we use to put things on YouTube and other forums, they all cost money. And when we've started to have a few in-person events at TC and Labour and in Mark's House and other places, and those of you that have come to them say you really appreciate them. So we'd like to keep doing that, try and do more of them, explore how we can do hybrid ones maybe in the future, because we know that that keeps things accessible to all of you and as inclusive as possible. But again, that costs money. So basically, we need donations from all of you to keep being able to do events such as today, and therefore giving a donation or becoming formally a friend and committing to giving a little bit each month, if that's easier for you, helps all of these wonderful events keep happening, keeping them free and open to everyone, and will mean that they can carry on into next year and the year after, because we definitely need them to carry on as things get bleaker around the world with the election of Trump and here as well, not going so great. So we want to keep giving platforms to socialist activists. We want to keep having these events. So please, if you can, click on the link in the chat and donate what you can. Thank you ever so much. And I'm going to hand you back to Andy and the rest of our speakers for today.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you. The links are in the chat, everyone. Have a look when you can. Our next speaker and our final speaker for this session is Sam Browse, Arise Festival and Orgreave Truth and Justice Campaign. Sam, you are very welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, and it's great to be on such a great panel. The title of this session is The Role of the State, Media and Ruling Class in Class War Britain, Lessons for Today. Both parts of that title are huge, teasing out the relationship between the state, media institutions and the ruling class, but also drawing out the lessons of the strike and the interrelation between all those things of how the left should organise today. But I think the main thread that draws them all together is politics. And that perhaps sounds like an obvious thing to say, especially to you. You've given up your Saturday afternoon. You're probably one of the most political crowds in the country. You're certainly one of the most discerning, I think. I can hear you thinking, you know, of course it's politics. The strike politicised the whole generation of people. It's the reason people from coalfield communities still spit after they say Margaret Thatcher. But what I mean by politics is that the strike posed fundamental questions about power in Britain, about who governs. And Jon spoke about this earlier. You know, that was the question that was asked 10 years previously during the successful 74 strike. The resounding answer to that question was not Ted Heath, who was removed in the subsequent election. And I think you can only understand the politics of the events of 84-85 through the prism of the removal of a previous Conservative government in the mid-70s. And in fact, the Ridley Plan, which was drawn up by the Conservatives, which has been alluded to in previous sessions, I think, in opposition, and which formed the template for the brutal policing suffered by the miners, explicitly mentions Saltley Gate, one of the main arenas of struggle in the 74 strike. The plan, I think, represents the learning of the strategists of the British ruling class in the wake of a defeat. And it was that plan, obviously, that they executed in their defeat of the miners in 84-85. But in addition to the lessons learned by the Conservatives after 74, I think we also have to look at what was going on in the Labour Party. And some socialist political thinkers have viewed parties as part of the state apparatus. So I don't think I'm diverting much from our topic today in exploring that for a bit. And the fact is that the economic situation posed significant challenges to the Wilson and Callaghan governments. Jon Trickett spoke about this a little bit earlier on. How to deal with that situation was itself a subject of debate, with divisions between the right of the Labour Party and the left. And representing the turn to the right, Callaghan famously said in 1976, "We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that that option no longer exists." So acting as the prelude to that foreshadowing of today's austerity was also Barbara Castle's In Place of Strife document, published 7 years before Callaghan's comments, which attempted to curb the power of organised labour, given the cracks appearing in Britain's already straining economy by 1969. I think the point here is that the leading element of the Labour Party had already kind of run out of ideas and had effectively ceded the political ground to the right. Tony Benn called their particular strategy, Strategy A, which is the government of national unity, the Tory strategy of a pay policy, higher taxes all round and deflation, with Britain staying in the common market. And in opposition to this was the Bennite alternative economic strategy, proposed by Benn at cabinet level, which called for a more radical democratisation of the economy and the levers of economic power. Benn's position paper, his alternative economic strategy position paper, defined it as Strategy B, this is a quote, "the real Labour policy of saving jobs, a vigorous micro-investment programme, import control, control of the banks and insurance companies, control of export, of capital, high taxation of the rich, and without wishing to raise the ghost of 2016, Britain leaving the common market." Think about that for a second. He was a cabinet minister making those, so not in opposition, he was a cabinet minister making those arguments from government, from a position of being in government, although he was in the minority. So in the years running up to the 84-85 strike, the leading faction in government, in the Labour Party, had run out of ideas. There was a Thatcherite challenge from the right, whose solution to the economic crisis involved the fire sale of public assets and the smashing of organised labour that was involved in the Ridley Plan, and in all those secret meetings that Chris Peace talked about earlier on. But there was also an incredibly dangerous, for capitalism at least, insurgent left, which acted as a radical opposition to both the leadership in Labour government and the incoming Conservatives. While it was defeated in the 81 Labour deputy leadership election, that Bennite current made further advances with Ken Livingstone's leadership of the GLC and the opposite ideological pole of attraction it provided to both Thatcher and the Kinnock Labour leadership. Of course, the Kinnock leadership refused to support the miners, as we heard earlier on. The reason I'm rehearsing these points is to stress that if the miners were to defeat the Thatcher government, the consequences could reach beyond the industrial horizon and the future of coal in the country. I think Niamh, began her talk by saying explicitly, this wasn't really about coal, this is about something much bigger. What it would have acted as is a block on the solution to the crisis represented by Thatcherism, rampant neoliberalism, and opened up an entirely different arena of struggle for a more progressive solution. So it's in that sense that great clip of Arthur Scargill earlier on, when he said the struggle of the miners was the struggle of all workers, is precisely correct, I think, and why it's so important that we learn from what happened in that period. So just to finish up on lessons for today, I think the main thing I would emphasise is that the political and the industrial are completely interlinked, and that the left today still has a lot to learn from both the leadership of the NUM, who best articulated that their struggle was a struggle of everyone, and the Bennite leadership of the left, who knew that for the left, political power and how we counter the power of the state, political power must be paired with power on the streets and power in the workplace, and crucially too, an orientation to the forces organising on the streets and in the workplaces too. Today, we're not without those massive movements. Just look at the mobilisations for Palestine, which challenge a key plank of how the British ruling class operates, namely on the level of foreign policy. You know, how a state or a country relates to another is a pretty fundamental issue. So our task today, I think, is to make those actions even bigger, to bring them into the wider Labour movement and fight for a political leadership that acts as the tip of the spear for our movement, for socialism, peace and international justice. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, Sam. Brilliant. So what we'll do now is we will now have some of your questions. I've got a couple lined up already. I will put them to the panel in one round and then let them come back on the ones that they wish to, and also give their closing remarks at the end. Please keep the questions coming. We've still got some time left. So the first question is from George on Zoom. He says, it's very clear from the speeches how the police were used to play an explicit class role in the strike. Of course, the Tories were the majority in Parliament at the time. I wonder what people's views are over whether the police could have / would have been able to play a similar class role if Labour were the majority in Parliament. More broadly, to what extent is the class role of the police dependent on parliamentary arithmetic? So we've got 3 speakers, Hugh, Niamh and Sam. Who would like to go first? Hugh?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. It's a very general question. I'd just like to expand it a little bit more because, I mean, I was speaking about GCHQ and police obviously raises the question about what about the apparatus of the state, be it the police, be it GCHQ, be it the security services and so on. There's a whole infrastructure there. And I don't think personally that it's the transitory changes of a parliamentary government that alter that fundamental relationship that exists between the apparatus that's used and the government of the day. Hopefully, you think a progressive Labour government would put more constraints on what the police can do in the circumstances of a strike. And certainly if the law changes, that provides a framework, but it's not normally been a sort of huge restraint around what the police do. The law is there as a thing for them to use, not to be used against them by and large in lots of circumstances. So I think going back to sort of some of the points that Sam was raising, it needs us on the left to think a bit more fundamentally about how we want the state to operate. What sort of police force do we want? What sort of state apparatus do we want? I don't think we'll do it just purely by looking at the oversight of it, but also about their role, you know. And so the police force is not a community police force. It's not drawn from, it's not operating in the interest. It doesn't, if you like, seek to protect the communities in which it leads. It seeks to police them, hence the name. So I think if we look at all of those various institutions, and the courts come into it as well, for there to be genuine change, I think we need to have a different left agenda about how it will go, and not just look to think that a change in government is going to fundamentally change those roles that have been embedded for decades, if not centuries.
Thanks, Hugh. Just realised I did have another question as well to read out. So unless Sam or Niamh want to come back on that, I will read the second question. Is that all right? Yeah, okie doke. So the second question is from a Facebook user who asked, could speakers outline more how important the media was in attacking the miners, and how do we build alternative media and ways of communication to get our messages out today?
I'm happy to jump in on that one if there's a space for it. I won't talk about the media and the miners, as I know people have more experience at that point than me, but I will talk about alternatives that we can have sort of today. I spoke a little bit earlier around the social media algorithms that are designed to squash authentic workers' voices and channel a very specific political view on our young people. There are alternatives to that, and we've seen it going beyond the UK into looking at the Arab Spring and early Twitter, how Twitter was pivotal in those grassroots communications. We have a social media network that is full of potential, but it's also full of a potential for the ruling class as a use of propaganda. And we need to absolutely stick together and build solidarity along social media as a new form of organising, because it is exactly what the ruling class and the far right are doing. And that is the only way that we can spread the true message, I suppose, in times like the miners' strike, when they happen in modern times today.
Absolutely agree, Niamh. It is very important that I think we move stronger into the social media platforms and we're more prevalent there, just to make sure that also we get more young activists on board, like yourself.
Should I come in? Oh, no, you go, Hugh.
Yeah. You and then Sam.
I was only going to make sort of one point, really. I mean, social media today is obviously changing how things are done, and we can see that on Palestine, where I've got a lot more experience. But I just harking back to the miners' strike, where I was around and active and so on, that there was no social media, and the media of the day, as we've heard already, were very hostile to the miners, to the strike, and so on. But what did take place during the miners' strike was person-to-person contact, so that there was miners going around speaking to students, speaking to workers, going to other factories. There was collections going on outside of tube stations. There was the women's groups organising. There were fundraising events. And I think in the current age, we ought not to forget the importance of talking to people, meeting with people, organising face-to-face. Over the decades, I have no faith that the media is going to be fair and on the side of the trade union movement or the left, and therefore we need to build infrastructures ourselves, and we can't do it purely remotely. We've got to do it by organising in a traditional way, and that involves in the workplace, that involves in the community, and so on. So we can use, has been referred to, social media as part of that process, but it needs to be an add-on, not the only thing that we rely on in those circumstances.
Thanks, Hugh. Sam?
Yeah, I was going to kind of echo a bit of what he said, and certainly
That's
agree.
Okay.
certainly agree with what Niamh said too about the importance of of using things like social media as a tool. It's it's a really useful organising tool. But I think the question originally asked, like, how important was the media? And I think I've got, like, I don't know, to sort of stir the pot a bit. I think I've got, like, because sometimes people sort of gasp when I say this, but I don't actually think the media is as important as people think it is, because they've always said horrible things about us, like, throughout history. But actually, the way we counter that is by building the union, building the left, building solidarity, and having those conversations. But yeah, and part of that I think also has to be, and as a tool for building our side, it has to be about you're getting involved in social media, Blue Sky, and all of the new stuff that's, like, kicking off now. But also going I'm one a plug for the website Labour Outlook. I'm one of the people who's volunteers behind Labour Outlook. That we regularly put things out on the day-to-day, about things that no one really things that nobody else talks about. It's only organisations like the Morning Star, for example, who publish roundup of strike action and things like that, and keeping the rest of the left, like, clued in, but also kind of opinion and acting as a real sort of space for sharing ideas as well. I think that's really, really important. But the reason why that's important for me isn't so much like countering media narratives. I think we do that by the fact of our existence and the fact of our organising. For me, it's about organising our people. It's about not just organising them physically, like sending them to pickets and things like that, but organising what's in their head as well, and, like, giving them the confidence and the ability to talk to other workers, other people at the demo, and make those things even bigger and bring people along. So yeah, I don't know. I think sometimes people can be like, the media are being horrible about us. They've always been horrible about us. They were in the miners' strike. The way we counter that, I think, is by building our institutions, not just media institutions, but building power, basically.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you. So we've got a second round of questions. These are slightly more general, so bear with me, they're a bit lengthy. The first one is, we have had a few comments and questions on social media and Zoom regarding Trump's re-election and how that could lead to even more authoritarianism and far-right developments around the world, and indeed in the UK. Would the speakers have anything to add on this? As Dave says in question form, given the fondness of Britain to assimilate anything from the USA, for example, billions, trucks, apartments, etc., what about US fascism with Trump? So that's question one. Question two is from John on Zoom. Would you agree that the neoliberals neutering the Labour Party was as crucial to reversing the gains made by the organised working class in the post-war period as breaking the back of the unions by attacking the NUM? And the questioner notes that when asked what was her greatest political achievement, Thatcher said, Tony Blair and the New Labour, we made the other side change their mind.
I can jump in on these.
Yeah, Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, so on the first one, I think absolutely, like the Trump, the election of Trump will spell out certainly more authoritarianism in the US, but the question, like, sort specifically about the UK, and I think that's true as well. If you look at British foreign policy at the moment, it's got a real Atlanticist orientation. It's, you know, like, and the comments from Lammy and comments from Starmer have kind of reinforced that, you know, in terms of the welcoming of Trump and all the rest of it. I think the election of Trump will be a disaster for Palestinians in terms of what did he call it, the deal of the century or something like that, which was his proposals last time around. And I think we'll see people come out on the streets in Britain to opposing genocide in Palestine. My fear in that context, where you have a kind of a Labour Party, a Labour government that is wedded to an American line on this issue, is that it becomes, you know, more authoritarian in opposing those demonstrations. And like, you know, we've already seen in terms of the opposition under the Tories to the pro-Palestine demonstrations, and the most outrageous things being said, slurs being thrown against people who are literally protesting for peace. You know, so I think that's definitely something to watch and guard against. But I think those, you know, just as under Suella Braverman, those things were defeated because I think my answer to all of these questions is we just need to build more. You know, we need to bring more people into the movement, because that's how we got rid of Suella last time, right? So by building more. So yeah, I think the questioner has a point, and but yeah, let's make those pro-Palestine demos even more big and even more powerful. The second question I'll leave to I've forgotten what it was, so I'll leave to the rest of the panelists because I've already spoken for long enough.
Thanks, Sam. Hugh, did you want to come in on either of the two questions? And I'm happy to repeat them as well. I know they were quite lengthy, so just let me know.
Just briefly on Trump, because Sam's covered quite a lot of it. But I mean, I mentioned when I was speaking actually that I think probably one of the worst nights of my life was in 1992, when all the GCHQ members had gathered together hoping for a Labour victory, and they lost, and they gradually went to bed quietly. And I felt a bit like that when Trump got elected. You didn't really want to hear, you didn't want to listen, you didn't want to know, because you feared for what happened. But I would just reiterate that message, that we got those SAC members back into the office on the following Monday and said, right, this campaign's got to go on for another 5 years. And they said yes, and stood up and took on the roles and responsibilities. And I think we've got to stand up now and think, oh God, but yes, there's another duty, task, responsibility for us to organise. And, you know, people rely on the fear for people to run away or to give up or to be fatalistic about things, and we mustn't be fatalistic. And just on neoliberalism, which everyone's referred to and so on, they had a long-term strategy going back decades to persuade the world that there was no alternative to neoliberalism, and they have been amazingly successful in that. And they put millions, if not billions, into winning that through academics, through books, through politics, supporting candidates, and so on. So I think our challenge now, and it links to the last question, is to build people's confidence that there is an alternative way for society to be run, that there is a socialist alternative, that we can do things together, and that it is possible for us not to have to give in to the neoliberal rhetoric. And it's become the norm. It has just become accepted by all governments across the world and so on. And Sam's mentioned already the Palestinian resistance. There is huge resistance going on across the world to what's going on. And what we've got to try and do, I think, is weave that resistance together in solidarity to make sure that we get people to understand they're not alone, but they're actually the majority of people who don't like what's happening and would like there to be an alternative.
Thank you, Hugh.
No,
Thank you.
Jump
Oh,
in.
Niamh.
We've run out of time.
Yeah, no, we've still got time. Please jump in.
Perfect. Yes. So I'm just going to build on what was already said, but kind of especially look at the kind of youth side of things, I suppose. So really, with Trump's re-election, what I think wasn't mentioned already by the other two panelists was the fact that it does represent the fact that our political socioeconomic system is in massive state of crisis. You know, just in this country, we're seeing obviously the cost of living. We've got the highest tax burden since World War II. We've got worse inequality since Henry VIII. By every metric, things are broken. They're not working. For young people, that is all we've ever known. And I think that's why we're seeing reform much closer than we think. Obviously, we've got Trump in the States, but the far right and the rise of authoritarianism is on our doorsteps, is in our communities. And I see it with my friends that were left-wing and have suddenly been absorbed by this rhetoric, this lie about what our society should be. And it's a cruel, cruel narrative. And similarly, what was already said, the only way to combat that is strength together. That is the only way we can win. Because today, standing together is an act of resistance in itself. Building community is strength. And that is the only way that we can support these people that and stop the threat of Trumpism closer to home. And just on the second point, touching on that, you know, unions have changed since the miners' strike. They've changed dramatically. But I think that there's a lot of hope in how young people are organising today. I've been involved in hospitality organising, which was labelled impossible, and we've done it. We've been on strike. And we've seen young people spearheading Palestine protests. We've seen young people at the front pushing for change because they know that there's no alternative anymore. We have to fight for what is right. So I think there's a lot of hope in a lot of scary times as well.
Thanks, Niamh. And I think it probably comes back to what Hugh was saying about what were the foundational principles that helped them win, and that was unity, commitment, and solidarity, and all those principles are so important today as well. So now we're coming to the end of the session. Any of you would like to have any closing thoughts before we come to an end? Hugh, go for it.
Never able to resist an opportunity to say something, but there were two points that I jotted down during the course which I haven't mentioned. One was there's been quite a lot of reference to Saltley Gates, and I'm old enough. I was actually there. I was a young student in Birmingham at the time, and went there. And it's talked about as a miners' dispute, which it obviously was. But the thing that turned the tables in Saltley were when the car workers in Birmingham came out on strike on the day when the gates were shut, and that ability for workers to take solidarity action, I think, is something that we have given up on, and we need to restore in people's minds as something that can be done, that it isn't just a case of industry by industry or workplace by workplace. It is workers acting together across those boundaries in solidarity. And Saltley was a prime example of that. And to if you like, treasure that memory that it was car workers and miners together that shut the gates, not just miners by themselves, if you like, that made the difference. And the other main point I'd like to make is that I remain a member of the Labour Party, have been for 40 odd years. And it strikes me that over the coming years, because of Trump, because of what's going on in Palestine and everything, actually the pressure of the left within the Labour Party to make the Labour Party be more progressive, to be independent, and not to go down the neoliberal track is even more crucial. And I know a lot of people make their own choices to walk away, but actually if the Labour Party doesn't feel the pressure from within, then it is going to make life easier for them when we need to be making life harder for them to follow a progressive agenda. So everyone fights where they want to, but let's not give up on trying to make sure the Labour Party what it should be, and that's the voice of workers in this country.
Thanks, Hugh. Thank you very much. Well, I think we're going to close this session now. We're going to have a 2-minute break before our next section, which is starting at 3 o'clock. I would just really like to thank all of our fantastic speakers for taking time out of their day and coming to speak to us today. Please have a look at the links in the chat because there have been lots of resources posted and also the link to donate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome everybody, and welcome to the final rally of the Arise Festival afternoon of events on class war in Britain, 40 years since the miners' strike. My name is Mish Rahman, and it's great to chair this closing rally at what has been a brilliant event. If you can, please donate at the link being posted in the chat so we can keep holding these important political education events such as this. Today, the miners who fought for their lives and livelihoods in the 84-85 strike are rightly seen as symbols of resistance who stood up against a Thatcher government who was intent on reshaping the economy decisively in favour of the ruling class. The miners' fight was the fight of all workers for a society that puts people before profits, and the defeat of the strike has had really deep lasting consequences. We now are the inheritors of an economy ruled by the chaos of market forces, which has delivered decades of pay stagnation, mounting levels of personal debt, huge disparities of wealth and income, and the rise of the gig economy and precarious work. And it's left deep scars on our coalfield communities, which have been left to fester as successive Tory and new Labour governments entrenched Thatcherism and the Thatcherite consensus. So with no alternative on offer, we've seen the gradual decline of community and labour movement bonds replaced with far-right and fascist organising, which has legitimised the mainstream racism in the media and on occasions from the dispatch box in Westminster. So while the damage has been lasting, the strikes also left strong enduring bonds of solidarity. It's reshaped attitudes and also driven progress. For example, no one can deny the central role of women who supported mine workers. Anyone familiar with the film Pride will know that the solidarity showed by lesbians and gays support the miners. It was the NUM who subsequently led the charge for LGBTQ+ rights in the labour movement. The struggle of the miners also attracted solidarity from workers across the world. So today in our final session, we're going to draw on that spirit of solidarity and resistance that animated the strike to rally for class unity, the fight for coal, not Dole, and the struggle for socialism. And we've got some wonderful speakers. We're going to move straight on to our speakers in this closing, Larry. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome and introduce our first speaker, good friend and comrade of mine, Ian Lavery, the Member of Parliament for Blythe and Ashington, I think it is now, Ian.
It is, yeah.
Former NUM president and striking miner at the time. Over to you, Ian.
Well, Mish, thanks very much for the kind invite for this afternoon. It's really important. It's 40 years on since the great miners' strike. Really important that we learn the lessons from the 1984-85 dispute, because I'm listening to a number of the speakers on the previous panel. Very interesting, I've got to say. I'm not sure if I agree with everything, Mish. I'm just not sure whether I agree with everything that's being said. One thing I'm absolutely certain of is that as trade unionists, as ordinary working people in ordinary communities, we will not win anything unless we have unity. We have numbers, we have strength in numbers, and we are prepared to fight, prepared to fight to the bitter end. And that's what the miners' strike was all about. It was a class war, the Tories versus the trade union movement, the Tories versus the working class communities, and the Tories wanted to destroy not only trade unionism, but organised labour and the strength in which organised labour held in communities up and down the country. I just want you to remember, man. I want you to remember the people who are no longer with us, who participated in the miners' strike all those years ago, 40 years ago. Some fantastic people, ordinary people who give their all on the picket line every morning for a year, every morning, every afternoon, every night, whenever they were called on to fight the fight. The fight was to try and fend off the attack of the Tory government in closing the coal mines basically cutting off opportunities of employment, good wages, terms and conditions, trade union recognised employment, and that's what Thatcher was about. And ordinary people picked up the cudgel in 1984, 85. It's a bit of a myth, you know, to think that everybody in the NUM were on the left. Just simply not true. Everybody in the NUM were working class, by the way, and everybody in the NUM knew what justice was, and they knew when they were getting kicked in the slats by the government. They knew when they were getting attacked, and they knew when to say enough is enough. And that's what the miners' strike was about. It was about continuing local communities, economies, looking after the kids, making sure that there was a future for every for every community whenever that arrived. But we look at the attack. We never forget, by the way, and it can happen anytime, the way in which a government can actually turn its and utilize the tools of the state against ordinary people, people who work at the pit. And that's, again, what happened. Thatcher turned, she utilised the tools of the state. She utilised the police, the armed forces. She utilised the courts. She utilised the solicitors, the police, all against ordinary working people. As I say, we shouldn't forget, you know, the miners' strike wasn't about wage terms and conditions. It was about preserving an industry and securing a future for our communities. Very laudable in itself. But this is what Thatcher and her henchmen and women did during the 1984-85 dispute. Very, very, very difficult times indeed. But listen, the word for this conference and many conferences is solidarity. Solidarity was so important, and it's so important now. Your previous speakers mentioned the fact that the only way forward is in numbers, strength in numbers. Everyone agreed with that. Solidarity. During the miners' strike, we had tremendous solidarity locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, globally. It was phenomenal. And I think that's what brought lots of people and meant that lots of people could basically last out a dispute. You know, the difference with the miners' strike and strikes we have now, and I support every one of the strikes, there wasn't any strike pay during the miners' strike. The miners didn't have any strike pay. We had nothing at all. I was in a family of 5, and then me mother and father were at home. My father was a striking miner as well. What we got when we went on the picket line was 2 woodbines and a cheese sandwich. And I mean, listen, I've never smoked in my life and I hate cheese, right? So I was really shafted. And we didn't have that. What we had the desire here. We had the desire to win because we wanted a better future for everybody. And that's what the miners' strike was about. It was about solidarity. And what about the solidarity we got from the trade union movement? Absolutely wonderful. The trade union movement for me is my family. The trade union movement, and again I heard it mentioned earlier that the trade unions aren't what they were. Well, the trade unions should be bloody what they were. And the trade unions are the best vehicle to oppose the government, to oppose the attacks everyone in our communities are under at this moment in time. The trade unions are the vehicle. It doesn't matter whether you're 15 or 16 or 66 or 76. Everybody should be in a trade union and collectively together in solidarity, camaraderie, we should be able to organise the labour because, you know, it's one of the only things we've got in life, and that is to withdraw our labour if things are in the workplace or unfair. So we've got to continue the fight of the miners' strike, learn from the lessons. I mean, listen, the oratory, you know, the big rallies we had were fantastic. We had some the best speakers ever. Scargill, Bickerstaff, Skinner, Bain, you name it. They were brilliant. And, once you had been to one of these rallies, believe me, you wanted to stop on strike for the rest of your life. But it was a camaraderie. It was a people who you worked with, who were prepared to give up everything to fight for a better future. And that was extremely, extremely important. We should never forget them, never forget, because there's too many people sadly passed on, class fighters. They weren't all members of political parties. They were just ordinary people, men and women, who knew that there was a grave injustice taking place and were prepared to do it. Before anybody ever mentions a ballot, of course we didn't have a national ballot, and it would have been wrong to have a national ballot because different areas would suffer differently as a consequence of the miners' strike. If the miners' strike was still on now, I'd still be on strike. Without a ballot, I'm not bothered about a ballot, because you're either right or you're wrong. That's the difference. And sometimes in life, you've just got to make that choice. A big shout out to the Women Against Pit Closures, because the Women Against Pit Closures are still fighting to this day for justice in our communities. We couldn't have done anything without the fantastic women during the miners' strike. And I'm not on about the women who just, stopped at home, whatever. I'm on about the people who didn't stand shoulder to shoulder, but got in front, on the front foot, supporting the miners, supporting their families, supporting their husbands, supporting their communities. Absolutely fantastic, the Women Against Pit Closures. I mentioned the way the police acted. I think it probably will have been discussed long and hard during this conference, this Arise conference today. The legal system. I mean, I could tell you some awful stories where I endured personally myself. I really did deserve to be arrested on a number of occasions, and I deserved it. But listen, I was fighting for my community. I don't want an apology, by the way. I'm one of these rare beasts of the NUM who isn't crying out for an apology or for the state to. I don't want any apologies from anybody, and nor does my family. We fought the fight for the industry. We fought the fight for ordinary people. We fought the fight for trade unions, and we'll continue to fight for the very same people. It's as simple as that. I don't want anybody apologising for what happened all those years ago. You know what? I enjoyed every minute. If I had actually been arrested for some of the things that I actually have done, God knows what they might have even thrown the keys away. That's all I would say. And I'm proud of it. And my friends are proud of it. We look back and think, about the different tales. It's amazing how many tales are severely embellished, by the way, about what happened on the picket lines, what happened in the communities. Fantastic tales. You'll never see them written in any books. Never, ever. Because people wouldn't allow that to happen. Talking about books, by the way, and just to conclude, that the reality is, I've read a lot of books about the miners' strike and agreed with very few. People rewrite history, man. They weren't there, but they rewrite it and say what should have happened. We didn't have an alternative during the miners' strike. We didn't have any alternative other than to withdraw our labour because they were coming for our communities. We either stood up and fought and fight, or we shirked back, rolled over, and got kicked to bits. We stood up shoulder to shoulder, and we took on the Thatcher government. We took on the police. We took on the army. Many people who were brought in by Thatcher, as I've already mentioned, and we're quite proud. It's easy to rewrite history, and with the benefit of hindsight, see what the miners could have done, and what they should have done, and what they might have done. We did everything we possibly could, everything during that year in 1984-85, and the message from that strike to the people listening today is that solidarity is so important. You can win, by the way, We've seen plenty of within the trade union movement. I think there's been a resurgence in the trade union movement as of late, and I think that there's been plenty of victories. And as I've mentioned, the trade union movement is the best vehicle to oppose the attack on our class. Solidarity at our levels, very, very, very important. We need to ensure that we look after each other, man. It's not rocket science, you know. It isn't rocket science. We need to stand up and be proud to stand up with each other, right across the communities, regardless of the colour of your skin, regardless of the country where you come from, regardless of where you work. You know, united we stand, divided we fall. And as my great comrade Arthur Scargill always used to say, the victory, we might not have won the miners' strike, but the victory was in the struggle itself. Comrades, solidarity and strength in numbers, and that isn't anything we cannot achieve.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that excellent message and emphasising the need and importance of solidarity and community and standing up for one another. Ian also emphasised that the miners' strike was a war on class. It was all about smashing our class and our trade unions and our hard-earned trade union rights. And he also gave us a great segue to two of the heroes of that era, Arthur Scargill and Tony Benn. Our next speaker has asked for 2 short videos from the archive to be shown before his speech, and those videos do namely include Arthur Scargill and Tony Benn. So if we could ask our production team to play the video.
That if the offence I've committed is a contempt, then I plead guilty, because the only contempt I've committed is to fight for my class and fight for my...
Comrades, it is one big struggle. It's not a lot of little watertight compartments where you can fight separately and hope to win. What the miners are doing is fighting for the nurses. And I notice Mrs. Thatcher has given them an increase because she doesn't want to take on the nurses and the miners together. It's a fight for the teachers, and I notice she's agreed that the teachers can go to arbitration because she doesn't want to take on the teachers and the miners together.
Oh, what's happened to me? Nothing misses me. Hi, Mish. I think you're muted. Should I just jump in? Hi, everyone. I'm not quite sure what happened there. I'm Matt Wilgress, National Organiser for Arise Festival, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today, and thanks to Mish for chairing, and thanks to everyone participating as volunteers, attendees and speakers at this great afternoon of solidarity, struggle and socialism. Particularly like to pay tribute to John Hendy and Ian Lavery for their contributions, people who were there at the time and know what really happened. And I'd like to emphasise what Ian said in particular about the need to fight and fight to the bitter end. And also, as well as paying tribute to them, I'd like to take the opportunity, as others have done, to pay tribute to everyone who was involved in that great strike and isn't with us today. And people like Tony Benn, of course, who did so much to support it and aren't with us today. And also pay tribute to the political leadership of the NUM at that time. And we've seen today some great videos of Arthur Scargill. And in this short contribution, I will quote him again, specifically his 1985 seminal conference speech, which I think will also be put in the chat so you can read it in full. I'm going to use those quotes to try and illustrate some of the key points I want to make, linking then and today. And I hope I'm going to give a different analysis to both the so-called mainstream analysis, which we hear a lot on the media, and also I think gets an echo on the right wing of the Labour movement, but also some of the positions developed on the far left regarding the miners' strike as the decades have gone on, some of which I think bizarrely echo the ruling class's points on questions such as the ballot issue, which both John Hendy and Ian have addressed so effectively today. In this seminal 1985 speech, which I mentioned you can read online. Arthur Scargill said that, and I quote, "The NUM has challenged the very heart of the capitalist system. We have refused to accept that any industry in capitalist society, whether public or privately owned, has the right to destroy the livelihood of men and women at the stroke of an accountant's pen. Our challenge has been met by an establishment reaction of unprecedented savagery." Illustrating how this had happened during the strike, he then argued that, and I quote again, "In hurling weapon after weapon at the miners, our enemies have revealed more than their hatred of us. They've revealed their own fear. Why had this happened? Because, and I quote again, their viciousness springs from the knowledge that the heart of their own class-ridden system is under attack." And I think what we've heard from so many people today who know a lot more about the miners' strike than me was that the stakes were high because of how the struggle they were engaged in challenged the very logic of the capitalist system. It said explicitly, as we have had said so many times before and since, workers will not pay for the boss's crisis. And more deeply looking back at the miners' strike now and the kind of left we need to build, I think we can also see how it's shone a light of methods of struggle and social alliances that are needed to wage any serious struggle for jobs and livelihoods, giving a glimpse of what a different kind of labour movement based on struggle and unity and fighting to the end, as Ian put it, could look like. Thatcher and co certainly understood that at the time, as did, I think, the people in the labour movement who advocated class collaboration. And that was why Thatcher and co did everything they could to defeat the strike and isolate and demonise the miners, as some of our other speakers, including Chris's inspirational contribution from the Orgreave campaign, have outlined. The same, as speakers in the last panel mentioned, could also be said of the offensives against the Benite movement and Ken Livingstone MacDonald's GLC and other left councils at the time. These, combined with the new leadership in certain unions, seemed to be the start of a new left, which did not accommodate to imperialism or division, and instead challenged the logic of capital's rule and fought consistently for a different kind of movement and a democratic movement. I would argue we need to return to that challenge of building a class struggle left today in the circumstances we face. And that is why also, and Ian and others have mentioned about what books there aren't available on miners' strike, and I would give an honourable shout out to our friend Seamus Milne's book, The Enemy Within, which is the authoritative left account on the miners' strike, and I would urge people to read. But I think that's why the memory of all those elements that I've mentioned above, the miners' strike in terms of what we're discussing, Tony Benn, Ken Livingstone and others, is still rubbish by the advocates of class collaboration in the labour movement today, because those struggles and those discussions continue. And if we are serious about understanding the defeat of the strike, as some speakers mentioned first session, including Chris, we must also be honest to look at how the role played by those elements in the labour movement who are stronger today than then, I think it's fair to say, who did the bidding of capital rather than working class people during the strike. As Scargill himself put it, again quoting from that speech, "It is a fact that the NUM did not receive the level of support we needed and are entitled to expect from national leadership." And he also quotes that the Labour leadership allowed itself to be preoccupied with allegations of violence scripted by the media when it should have been attacking the Tory government and defending our members in the same way as Thatcher defended her white squad in blue. But that doesn't mean we should forget how many unions and other parts of our movement, including rank and file Labour members and other left groups, of course, across the country, gave amazing support to the miners, as Ian Lavery mentioned so strongly. And also how many refused to not give up that fight for so long alongside the miners, including again in the 90s. What an inspiration we can take today. And therefore, as the video from Tony Benn argued, we can only win if we stand in solidarity with each other. Indeed, the NUM during the strike understood this. With the entire arsenal of the capitalist class against them, they set out to mobilise throughout and beyond our movement and win allies to their fight. Others have mentioned, including Ian, the flowering of the Women's Against Pits closures. Mike Jackson is unwell, so can't be with us today, but people would have seen in the film Pride about lesbian and gay support to miners. Less known, but equally important, I would argue, the nationalist community in the north of Ireland did a lot in solidarity to miners, and many black communities, including those fighting for black sections in the Labour Party, showed levels of support. These developments were no accident. These were the same forces that were also being demonised by Thatcher as the enemy within at the time. And indeed, a little known thing but of great interest is that the Labour conference during the strike, the miners' union backed women electing their own NEC members and voted for black sections, moves towards building a united front of the entire working class in all its diversity, which in struggle could then become an alliance for socialist change. We must also learn, and Ian touched on this as well, from the miners' strike, the workers and other groups fighting for their liberation must rely on their own organisations, their own strengths and their own methods to struggle, not those of the ruling establishment. To conclude, in terms of our work today, with the Starmer government doubling down on a failed system of neoliberalism, racism and war, we know there will inevitably be big struggles ahead. We face in Britain one of the oldest, most ruthless and most established ruling classes in the world. To defeat it, we not only need to fight of sectional battles, but we'll need to work together in solidarity with the champion of all the oppressed here and around the world. And as the NUM and Scargill also understood, and as we look on with horror at what is happening daily on our screens in Gaza and Lebanon today, that struggle for socialism must have anti-war internationalism at its centre. I'll end again by quoting Arthur Scargill, as the relevance to what he's saying is very obvious to what we see today. In that speech, he said, "As we view the horror of incessant warfare in Lebanon, or watch while thousands die of hunger in the third world, we cannot forget that our own struggles are connected with those of workers everywhere. And as we see the nuclear madness of the ever-increasing arms race, we must rededicate ourselves to campaign for peace. Without world peace, there is no hope for any of us. We must campaign until the billions spent on weapons and death and destruction are spent instead on providing an improved quality of life. Thanks, comrades. Let's all fight for peace and socialist change."
Thank you so much, Matt, for your important message. Unfortunately, technical problems deprived us of the wonderful introduction I had for yourself, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. That was Matt Wilgris of Arise, a festival of left ideas, part of the host who set up today's event. Please don't forget that if you can, please donate at the link being posted in the chat so we can keep holding these important political education events like this. And thanks to Matt and everybody at the Arise team for holding this event. Again, the message is clear, the message of solidarity, the importance of keeping, looking after each other, and also great to hear from legends of our movement, Arthur Scargill and Tony Benn, and tributes to them as well. Our next speaker is also a wonderful speaker and a good friend and comrade, Sabby Dhalu of Stand Up to Racism. As you all know, the recent riots that we faced in the summer, Stand Up to Racism has been leading the fight against and the counter protests against far-right movements and fascists on our streets. It's a pleasure to have you, Sabby, with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mish, and thank you for inviting me to this very important event. It's an honour and a privilege to mark the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike. I'm particularly pleased to highlight the role of African, Caribbean and Asian communities in showing solidarity with and supporting striking miners, and also the support for Black communities by the leadership of the NUM at the time. For example, Arthur Scargill and the NUM leadership supported the Labour Party Black sections, which led to the election of Black MPs, including Diane Abbott MP in 1987. The miners' strike also showed how the state, police, courts and media collaborate to undermine the working class. The miners were treated in the same way Muslims, refugees and Black communities are treated today. I'd like to pay tribute, as others have done, to Arthur Scargill and the leadership of the NUM at the time. Faced with the choice of throwing miners on the dole or fighting to defend miners' jobs, Scargill and the NUM chose to fight and strike. The miners' strike is particularly inspiring because the NUM had a very politically advanced and internationalist perspective. And his words then, as Matt Wilgris read out earlier, were as true in 1985 as they are today. It's also important to note that there were Black miners at the time that were involved in the strike, including those who went on strike at the time in the East Midlands when others in the region scabbed on the miners. In Gedling Colliery in Nottinghamshire, there were Black miners from 15 different Caribbean, African and Asian countries. And these Black miners were proud to go on strike along with their fellow white miners. A diverse range of Black communities also supported the miners' strike. So internationally, Black South African miners in the NUM there in South Africa raised money for the strike. And this solidarity was reciprocated because the NUM supported the struggle against apartheid South Africa. And in Britain, a range of Black communities supported the strike. The miners' strike took place at the same time as African, Caribbean, and Asian communities were subjected to police brutality. The Brixton riots took place 6 months after the miners' strike. So these communities identified with the miners on the picket lines who were brutalized and in some cases criminalized. There was enormous generosity from African, Asian, and Caribbean communities for the miners. So, for example, African and Caribbean communities at Notting Hill Carnival, Indian Workers Association members, Muslim communities up and down the country raised huge sums of money for the miners, donated a lot of food, and they also mobilized people to join the picket lines. And Mukhtar Dar, the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement organizer, he organized several people from the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement to go to Orgreave and recall the terrifying police brutality at the time. And regarding the Asian Youth Movement approach, he said, bear with me, there were individuals within those communities who had racist views. But when we went into those mining communities, we recognized that just as we were fighting, that just as we were a tight-knit community, they were too, a community constituted by its relations to the means of production. And as a community, they saw their future being eradicated. They had the same hatred for the police as we did, for the scabs, for the people who were selling out within their ranks. So there were a lot of synergies and there was a lot of commonality, and not just with the miners, with the Irish communities, with the African Caribbean communities, we had common experiences and a common fight. Even though we organized autonomously, we saw our struggle as one. So I think that highlights the importance of solidarity, as other people have mentioned, in support of the striking miners. So I just want to also quote Benjamin Zephaniah, who we sadly lost last year, but who also did a lot of work in support of the miners' strike at the time. So Zephaniah noted that the miners realized they couldn't win the fight on their own. They needed the solidarity of their wives, Black poets, Chinese chefs, and Bengali factory workers. Those who were involved in that strike will never forget the picket line battles, the worker solidarity, the lessons learned through struggle, and the dark forces of the police and state that were unleashed upon these workers. So powerful words there from Benjamin Zephaniah and also Mukhtar Dar from the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement. And so in conclusion, I think the miners' strike illustrated the importance of waging a struggle when under attack, international solidarity, and uniting all sections of the working class, including Black communities, women, LGBT, and all oppressed communities. Thank you very much, and solidarity.
So much, Sabby. Very important message, and a stark reminder for everybody that our class, the working class, is not just white, it's not just male, it's black, it's brown, it's Christian, it's Muslim, it's Jewish, it's male, it's female, it's of all faiths and none, it's gay, it's straight, it's trans, it's of all genders, all non-binary. That's what our united working class looks like, and that's what it is. Important message from Sabby, and some good references also to various organisations. I hold dear to my heart, the Asian Youth Movement, the Indian Workers Association, and some legends of that time. Our next speaker and final speaker in the rally today, one of the fantastic women of a trade union movement that in Lavery before referred to, the great women at the time of the miners' strike, and some of the great women in our trade union movement right now. She's Sarah Woolley, who is the General Secretary of the Bakery, Food and Allied Workers Union, and also the President of the General Federation of Trade Unions. Pleasure to have you, Sarah. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Mish. It's great to be able to contribute to this brilliant event today. Please excuse my voice, it's hanging on by a thread. I've loved all the contributions in the different sessions. I've been listening in the background, and the historical video clips have been absolutely fabulous. Our history as workers is steeped in stories of resilience, solidarity and sacrifice. From the miners who fought for coal, not Dole, to the brave struggles of fast food and hospitality workers organising today, one thing remains constant. When we fight together, we win. And that is exactly the mantra of our members at Rathbones in Wakefield. And they're using that whilst we fight against Morrison's, who plan to close their site in January. So please sign the petition and send the board the letters that are circulating to help us apply pressure. I'll put links in as soon as I've finished, so you can do that and support our members. The fight during the miners' strike wasn't just a battle for jobs or the right to work. It was a fight for communities, families and the dignity of our class. The state waged a war to crush the power of organised labour, but the miners and their supporters, especially the women that Ian mentioned, the amazingly inspirational women against the pit closures, they stood tall, demonstrating the power of class unity. The lessons from that struggle are clear. When workers are united across industries, backgrounds and borders, we become an unstoppable force. Divisions, whether by class, race, gender or nationality, are tools of those in power to keep us down. And our task as trade unionists is to break these barriers and stand shoulder to shoulder, absolutely no matter what. Today, the challenges we face might look different, but the underlying struggles are the same. The gig economy and zero-hours contracts exploit workers in ways reminiscent of the Industrial Revolution. Public services are gutted, whilst billionaires see their profits continue to soar. And in the face of a climate crisis, instead of investing in sustainable industries, the ruling class clings to a system of extraction and exploitation. But let's be clear, the power to change all of this doesn't lie in parliaments, as brilliant as Ian and other comrades are, or the boardrooms. It lies with us, the working class. And we've already seen what we can achieve. Hospitality workers unionising. We had McDonald's staff taking strike action for fair pay for the first time a few years ago. BFAWU members are leading the fight for £15 an hour minimum wage and the right to decent work. And so many more. These victories are just the beginning. The fight for socialism is the fight for a system where wealth and power are in the hands of people who create it. It's about building a world where no one has to choose between heating and eating, where every worker has the right to a secure job with decent pay and when communities are thriving instead of just barely surviving. And for trade unions, this means stepping up in every single way that we can. We must strengthen organising because union density is power. Every new member is a step closer to workplace democracy. Champion green jobs. Just as the miners once powered this country, we must demand investment in industries that will power a sustainable future, industries that provide unionised, well-paid jobs. Demand economic justice. From fighting for a living wage to taxing corporate greed, we must continue to lead the charge against inequality. Build bridges, not walls. Solidarity must transcend borders. As capitalism exploits workers globally, we must stand united with workers in every corner of the world. Our anthem, Solidarity Forever, reminds us that the union makes us strong. These are not just words to sing at the end of a conference, but a call to action. Every strike, every picket line, every act of resistance builds the foundation we need for a better world. Solidarity means more than just showing up. It means believing in the power of collective action to transform our society. It means understanding that your fight is my fight is your fight, and that an injury to one is an injury to all of us. Friends, the fight for socialism isn't a dream, it's a necessity. In a world where the rich go richer while the planet burns and more of our friends, family and communities are pushed further into poverty, we have no choice but to organise, but to resist, and absolutely to demand better. We owe it to the miners who stood in the face of Thatcher's war on the working class. We owe it to today's workers striking for justice. And most importantly, we owe it to the generations yet to come. Let's make solidarity forever more than a slogan. Let's make it our reality. Together, with class unity, we can build a future where the needs of the many come before the greed of the few. Support our members at Morrison's. The BFAWU supports you in the fights you are having now and the ones that you will inevitably have in the future. Together, we will make the changes we need. And if you're watching this and you're not in a union, join one today and be active. Solidarity, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and a wonderful message to end today's event. If you're not in a union, join one. And thanks everybody for coming. Please do continue to donate to Arise and join us at our forthcoming events, including on Thursday, the annual Engels lecture. Thank you, everybody, and thanks to all our speakers, and thanks to Arise again for hosting. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.